Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera. Anda sedang menonton agenda Awani secara langsung dari studio Awani Bukit Kewangan Kuala Lumpur. Dan malam ni saya ingin berundur dua tapak ke belakang sebenarnya. Saya bukanlah seorang pakar ekonomi, tapi saya ada seorang pakar ekonomi pembangunan dan melihat kepada kelestarian malam ni. Isunya mudah saja kalau nak difahamkan. Kita mahu membangun, kita mahu menuju ke depan, tetapi kita tidak mahu melakukan perkara itu tanpa memikirkan kesannya kepada generasi masa depan. Kita tidak mahu hanya membangunkan ekonomi yang menggunakan pelbagai sumber, tapi menyebabkan sumber itu semakin berkurangan, pupus dan sebagainya, sehingga generasi masa depan menerima akibat dan musibahnya. Dalam konteks itu, saya ingin meminta izin untuk berbicara dalam bahasa Inggeris kerana saya ada Profesor Dr. Ananta Durayapa, Pengarah Eksekutif Program Dimensi Manusia Antarabangsa, Universiti Bangsa Masa Bersatu ataupun UNU. I would like now to welcome Professor Ananta Durayapa. Thank you so much for making time. I was just telling the audience back home that to me it's a very simple discussion tonight. We want to develop, we want to move forward in the development of our country, for example, but we don't want to do that in such a way that we know we can already see the problems now, but we know that the problems are going to grow larger and larger for the future. We don't want to leave Malaysia as we know it, if we scope it just to this country, to the future generation depleted of so many things that they already are not enjoying even now when they are kids, for example. So based on that, linking it to the bigger picture, I guess my first question to you, I will go into the symposium beyond GDP a bit later, but I guess the main thing is we have always been trying to progress, but sometimes the changes that we've been making are actually incremental only. But maybe we need to rethink, we need a reboot, a reset, or whatever it is, to look at structural matters that is maybe beyond just the powers of one nation, but humankind in its entirety, to really stop, look back, learn and move forward. The reason I'm saying all this is because sometimes we just continue for continuity's sake, but maybe we haven't stopped enough to consider and reconsider. And I know it sounds philosophical, but if we look at all the conventions going around the world, Kyoto and then Rio, a lot of the apprehensions and the ambiguity is because leaders cannot come together. Different needs and interests cannot be merged and solidify an agreement being brought upon. But maybe if we put on a new mindset, then we'll see the strength of cooperation first before we see the differences. I give it to you to explain.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. As you know, this is actually my home country, although I've been away for quite some time. A lot of the themes that you bring up are extremely important, and it's actually philosophical. We are getting down to the notion of what exactly means progress, what does well-being mean. It's a much loaded concept, and philosophers throughout time have been discussing about this particular issue. I think it's, one of the major problems is inertia. It's difficult to change.
Okay.
So let me sort of backtrack a little bit. So we look at this term GDP. It's become a mantra, and about a couple of months ago, or rather a couple of weeks ago, in The Economist, I call that one of the biggest culprits.
Okay.
But I'll talk about that a bit later. So they were covering the Indian elections.
Okay.
And I was just leafing through it, and in capital letters it says GDP is king.
Okay.
And that's basically the main driving factor for nearly every political party is GDP, i.e. income.
Yes.
And I think that you can trace back in history, because when we're going back to the Great Depressions. This is the 1930s,
Yes.
And the world was in a real turmoil. Unemployments were very high. People were, majority were not being able to get employment to feed their families. The whole industrial complex has collapsed, and they were trying to struggle to see how can we reboot the system. And at that point, there wasn't a framework. Surprisingly, there wasn't an economic framework. And so a couple of people from the U.S. Department of Commerce, Simon Kuznets, who then went on to win the Nobel Prize for his work on, he developed the whole notion of GDP and the system of national accounts that we have right now.
Okay.
So it's got a long baggage there, 70, 80 years. Very robust framework. But it was developed at a time when things were different.
Yeah.
The demands were different. And then we had the World War II. It served very well for the Allies in terms of planning, because they had a framework, they had data. Information was really critical, and they didn't have that information. And right now, they had a framework that had that information, and you could see the linkages and stuff. And then once the war was over, countries were again trying to rebuild, and this framework really worked well, because you're looking at the initial conditions where we were.
Yep.
Now remember, the population at that time, the global population was only about, I think, 2 to 3 billion.
Okay.
So very low compared to where we are right now, 7 billion and climbing daily. And we are expected to reach 9 billion in about 2030, 2050. So we had a huge planet, we had a small population, we had resources, abundant resources. People were at very low levels of destitution, so primarily like poverty as we define it. So based on those conditions, that economic model worked well. It worked well for especially the present caliber of developed countries that we have right now. These were the main countries that were coming out of the war. But then things started improving. We saw quality of life or standards of living. I would still sort of keep away from the quality of life, because there's an important distinction to make in the standard of living versus the quality of life. So the standard of living went up. People had a security of employment. Resources were abundant, and so things were working quite along. But then with a massive improvement, or rather growth in population, developing countries were now starting to come online. The resource base was under stress. We live in a finite planet. And a planet that looked very large only 60, 70 years ago, now suddenly looks so very small. And so the whole notion of countries trying to push for their own growth, living in a small planet. So think of a cake. That's all you have. And if you want a large slice, it means somebody else has to have a smaller slice. So the challenge for us right now is, how do we distribute this pie, but at the same time to make sure that we are continuously refilling so that the pie remains there.
Prof, please hold that point. I have to go for the first break, but once we are back, I want to give the analogy of Avatar, the movie, and Pandora. We don't have a Pandora, for example. If we have, then we wouldn't be discussing this. For now, this is the only planet that we have, and there have been people telling me, and a lot of them are experts, saying that the way we're consuming things, we're going to need 4 planet Earth or more going into the future, but we don't have that. We don't have that luxury. So what do? Let's discuss that after this short break. If you have seen Avatar, you would have loved the way Pandora, the planet, is set up. And the whole concept about ownership and Mother Nature is all intertwined. But we're not living in Pandora, we are living on Earth. And statistics have proven that the way and the rate we are consuming things will not be sustainable pretty soon. So what do? Changing bit by bit is not enough. A major structural look or relook is very imperative. So I would like Professor to continue on the trajectory that he was on before this.
So it's an interesting link that you bring up with the movie, and it's about the notion of well-being. I want to bring a little bit about some of the studies that we have done in psychology. It's a fascinating area of research. We economists, I was trained as a neoclassical economist, and we tend to look at things primarily from maximizing net benefits. And we look at costs, we look at benefits. But we are humans, and we don't really work in that way.
Yes.
And there have been some very interesting studies coming out from Richard Astelin at University of Southern California, but also people like Daniel Kahneman, who was a psychologist but won a Nobel Prize in economics. And if anybody is interested, I really would recommend his book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow.
Okay.
It's an excellent book. So what they find, and this is not just hypothesis, but doing surveys of people, continuous across countries, developing, rich, poor, urban, rural, and what they find is that material wealth, income, which is then captured by the GDP, gross national income or gross domestic product, is actually, it's important, but it's not right at the top of a lot of people's lists.
Okay.
There was a very major study done by the World Bank, Voices of the Poor, which also found the same thing. And these were targeting people at the lower income levels. So there is a saturation point. And most of the studies, actually, interesting, I was puzzled. I thought something was wrong here when I looked at the paper for the first time, is that it says that around $8,000 to $10,000 US, people switch to other things that they value. Okay. So it's important to not get into extremes. It's not a zero-sum game as we're talking about during the break. It's not about, it's either this or that. It's about moderation, and it's about where we want to then switch our aspirations to. So we find that across many countries, now it's still debated within the academic community, but that's what we like to do. We always continuously like to debate about controversial issues. But it's pretty much quite well taken by a large group of scientists that about around 8 to 10,000 US dollars, this is enough to basically achieve what you really need. Things like shelter, things like health, education. But after which aspirations of social relations become very important, self-esteem becomes very important, things like health and leisure. I think what they have found is that people are really tired of being, to use the metaphor of mice in a Ferris wheel, and that's what we find ourselves in. We're just continuously running, and in psychology they call it the hedonic treadmill. You know, I look at somebody else and I say, if I'm not competing with him, then I'm going to be left out. So we get into this vicious cycle. And what they find is that the majority of people would like to get out of that vicious cycle, but they're struggling on how. And so we are talking about institutional reforms, societal reforms. Education is going to be extremely important. The whole notion of being very competitive is trying to better than the other needs to be. So we're talking about some very structural changes at the very root level of our value systems. And that's going to be extremely demanding, challenging, but something that we need to address.
If we were starting from a level playing field, then it might be easier. But you know, if we look at humanity on Earth, for example, that's pluralism is good, but it can also be making people stay within their own periphery of ideas, of you know, conviction, and not wanting to venture beyond. Because if we only look at competitiveness but not look at the whole bigger picture, then what's good for us might be bad for some other people. But when I read on material for this discussion, the concept of equity really struck me because, so yes, I can amass trillion of US dollars, but at the end of the day, to achieve self-actualization, I still need others. So how would my relationship with others be? And if I map that to countries around the world, yes, you want to run ahead, but run ahead where? And you will still have to negotiate with other countries. So how do we get this back if we are not using GDP? Because a lot of people around the world might be very familiar with the whole GDP thing, but if we were to go beyond that, where do we start? What do we hold on to? What are the parameters? Because subjectivity sometimes can bring uncertainty to a lot of people. Prof, I'm sorry I asked very long questions here, but I'm trying to cram everything within the last segment that we have, and we have to go for the last break. But once we are back, let's try to unravel that after this. Thank you so much for still watching Agenda Awani. We're a bit philosophical tonight. Well, we need to be, because we're looking at structural changes and maybe a paradigm shift to a lot of things that maybe we have taken for granted. Yes, we are trying to model our own way of development, but we are still using measures and yardsticks. For example, we're looking at progress in our country, measuring a lot by looking at GDP, for example. But how does GDP measure what we have in Kinabatangan, for example, an ecosystem, a natural ecosystem that we have inherited, where the three most endangered species in the world, the pygmy elephant, the orangutan, and the proboscis monkey, they're all there in one area. But if we continue to industrialize that area, of course it will not be sustainable for them. So, but how would that be reflected in our GDP, for example? So all that and more we're discussing now. We have a few minutes left, so I would like to allow Prof. Nanda to continue on that trajectory. And if I may ask you to maybe look at that GDP equation, because we're now so much looking forward to let everybody on average earn 15,000 US dollars per month, and to us, that's the target, to be a developed nation. But question is not about earning 15,000, but what would 15,000 mean at that time?
Thank you. So, long questions, but very tough ones. So, let me start off with the easy one, which is 15,000, which seems to be a magic number.
Yeah.
It's a 2020 target, I believe, for Malaysia. And I would assume that nearly every other country, developing country, is pushing for that, because that's the benchmark that the World Bank has used is 13,000. And if you achieve 13,000 per capita, that's per capita, you are considered a developed country.
Okay.
Just back of the envelope calculations, that requires 3 planets or 4 planets, based on the resource use that we have. I would say then, with the critics will say, hey, technology will save the day. So I will assume we have good technological innovations that we have had over the past 80 years or 100 years or so. I would say then, at the best case, we still need 2 planets. And we don't have 2 planets. We only have 1 planet.
Yes.
So again, to re-emphasize, and the way, especially when countries negotiate, and we're talking only about the environmental issue, but I also want to emphasize is the social issues are also very important. So the 2 things that we think are that are critical to be addressed, if we are looking at for the future of humankind, is inequity.
Okay.
We need to address the inequity issues. Just giving very quick figures, for the US, 1% owns 40% of the wealth.
Okay.
That's just not acceptable. And in this country, I think it's 40%, same wealth, is owned by 10%.
Okay.
Still not acceptable. And people also don't like that situation. I don't have the time to go in, but there was a very nice study done. It's called Americans Prefer to be Swedes.
Okay.
And when they were shown the difference equity, they were appalled to see what their country was. They were not aware of it.
Yeah.
But they were, given the hypothetical, they chose the one that they preferred, which was the Swedes. But they did not like a completely equal society as well, because it takes away that thing that I want to, you know, that thing that we want to be aware in our head. So that's important. The second thing is the sustainability issue. And that's the one that I want to address a little bit before I guess you'll cut me off as we end this interview, is that with the sustainability issue, the one thing that we need to realize as a global community is that we are all interlinked.
Yes.
We're not only interlinked by the fact that we are all humans of one particular species, but we are all interlinked by the fact that the systems that we use are interlinked. So what you do at a very small scale in a small village, somewhere in let's say, Pahang, will have an impact on somebody else right across on the other side of the ocean, maybe in Canada.
Yes.
And that interconnection was not as strong before because of the fact of the sheer size of the people on the planet. But as we grow and as we improve our communications, our transportations, we are becoming smaller and smaller.
Prof, we have about 1.5 minutes. So sometimes it can seem so gloomy and doom when we discuss this. But humankind always react best when we push to a corner, for example, and history is, you know, it's littered with that. So what silver lining can you see from this situation that we are in now? Because otherwise we will not have hope. But hope will always have to be there, and then we can continue to debate. When there's hope, there's always debate.
Well, I don't want a catastrophe to happen. We don't want another world war. So hopefully we don't get to that corner. I think it's education. Our education systems are the ones that would basically change, and our future, the youth, starting right from the little ones, and to have a system where the issue of, as again come to the two terms, sustainability and equity are built into the schooling system, and it becomes part of our value system. That the first reaction is to think about sustainability and to think about the fellow human person that you're interacting with. And if we can get an education system moving towards that, I'm very optimistic that we will be able to solve the problems that we have, and we don't go into the next climate change negotiations are in Paris, and China saying it's us, and you're compromising us instead of you, rather than looking at it as a global citizens
that everybody
of
has
one
ownership
planet.
over. Thank you so much, Prof, for making time to be here. It's always great to speak with great Malaysians who spend a lot of time overseas and now back here to share knowledge. But you can share knowledge with us some more. Anda juga boleh berkongsi dengan kami pelbagai pendapat anda. Saya sendiri akan berada pada 19 Mei ini, hari Isnin ini, di Hotel Hilton, bercakap tentang simposium melampaui GDP ataupun beyond GDP. Prof akan ada di sana dan juga pakar-pakar lain. Hantarkan pandangan anda sendiri kepada pelbagai platform yang Astro Awani ada, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube sebagainya, atau muat turun aplikasi Mudalih, iOS dan Android. Dan insyaAllah kita akan terus membincangkan isu seperti ini. Malam ini agak berfalsafah, tapi hari lain kita akan tarik keluar bahagian-bahagian spesifik. Terima kasih kepada Pejabat Penasihat Sains Negara, UNU, IHDP dan juga MIT untuk diskusi malam ini. Sekian, jumpa lagi. Thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you very much.